Well, what's up, everyone? I'm Matt Kreiser, and this is the Matt Kreiser Show. Today, I'm so excited to have on Geoff Brown, the CEO and president of USA Properties, which is one of the largest developers and owners of low-income housing in the country. Geoff's been a developer of low-income housing since 1989 when he joined the firm his father founded in 1981. So I'm excited today to get into all this with Geoff. We've seen housing prices go through the roof, whether it's, expensive to rent or the home that you owned has gone up, 10, 20, even 30% in value since COVID. So Geoff, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Happy to be here, Matt.
All
Look
right.
forward
So
to our discussion.
yeah, it's going to be good. We're going to get into it. So let's go ahead and get into it. It doesn't matter if, you're low income and you're struggling to make rent, or, you own a home or you were looking to buy a home and you've seen it just go up so much since COVID last March. What do you think's going on here?
Well, a number of things are going on. If you take a historical perspective of California, and I'm not just talking affordable housing, I'm talking all housing. The state tends to have peaks and then, a couple valleys. I'm old enough to not only remember the 2008 recession, but also the 1990-91 recession when we had the defense-based closures and the savings and loans kind of went sideways. And then in the late 90s, we had a pretty, and that's when the Clinton administration, followed by the Bush administration, wanted everybody to be a homeowner. And they freed up, there was a lot of liquidity in the market at that time, kind of similar to now, and I'll get to now in a minute. But in the early 2000s, you had a lot of single family building going on, a lot of crazy lending, which led to a lot of escalation in prices. And then what occurred in 2008 is the bubble burst. And one of the things that's contributing to the condition now is when that bubble burst, there was no building, and you had a lot of subcontractors and laborers leave the industry because there was no work. And I can remember in 2011 saying what's going to happen is the market is going to come back, and we're going to have a scarce resource of labor. And the same is true, like right now, lumber has gone up like literally 300% in the last 18 months.
And there's no way that that's just pent up demand, though, right?
No,
there's got to be some
what
monetary
it
policy there.
is I'm getting back to 2008.
Right.
Not only did subcontractors leave the industry, laborers leave the industry because there was no work, you had lumber mills that were cranking out a lot in the housing boom of the 2000s, that all of a sudden there was no demand for lumber at that point. And so you had lumber mills close. You also have politics in like Oregon, where most of the lumber now produces on private land because the environmentalists won't let it be produced on lumber on public land. So you have that going on as well. But you had a contraction of supply, building supplies, materials, and labor, and not all supplies, but various supplies and labor. And so you didn't really see the effects of that until 2015. And then 2015 in the apartment industry, we really started seeing construction costs from, I would say, middle of 2016 to now the middle of 2021. We're basically there now. Last 6 years, you've had basically doubling of construction costs, what I consider sticks and stones. And part of that's labor again, and part of that's material. And now you're asking me specifically in the last year, what's contributed to that condition in the COVID era. And I can tell you, we've had low interest rates stay low. We've had a significant, for between 2015 and the end of, say, 2019, there wasn't a significant increase in single family home production. All of a sudden, you drive around Sacramento and all of a sudden they're building everywhere you can turn around, which means, builders need lumber, builders need workers, et cetera. And so that I think is contributing to the condition a lot. But you have millennials coming into the market, you have low interest rates, and it's a crazy condition. A good friend of mine went into contract in a house out in Rockland in January. And I saw her about 3 months ago, just getting married. She said if we went into, and I'm guessing her house, I didn't ask her, but I'm guessing it's in the $600,000 range for a entry-level house. So not cheap when you're starting out. She said if she went into contract today, being, when I saw her like 4 weeks ago, that number would have been $100,000 higher. So what that partly tells me is, back to what I'm saying and what happened in 2008 when you had all the crazy lending going on that propped up single family development and prices, you have to ask yourself, will the bubble in the single family market burst at some point again? But the other thing that is another big part of what's going on is the migration out of the cities into the suburbs. Real estate values in downtown San Francisco and downtown LA and downtown San Francisco or Sacramento have not gone up in the last 15, 16 months because people don't need to be where their jobs are. You don't have restaurants open. You don't have stadiums open. You don't have theater open. There's not. So those areas have not gone up in value. But the cause and effect of people migrating out of those areas has created inflation and increase in building and values going up in the suburban areas. And we've seen that in our apartments too. We just sold and closed a market rate apartment project yesterday in Roseville. We have another one in Folsom. And these are big projects, 300 units. And I think we benefited from that migration out of the Bay Area to Sacramento. I think the Inland Empire down in LA is experiencing the same thing, where we have a project right now in San Jose, Santa Clara, that is struggling to lease up because, again, now that
is that a market rate or low income housing?
That's a market rate.
Okay.
And I'll get to the affordable in a second. But I think that settles out as we come out of the COVID. And the other thing is the one we have in Santa Clara is the elderly. Elderly haven't been wanting to move as much. The over 55 population hasn't been as mobile as the under 55 population during this time. So that's part of what also is going on there. So I do think going forward, I think there's plenty of pent-up demand still in the affordable housing. I mean, we're supposed to be building all types of housing, 180,000 units a year. And that could be an apartment unit or a single family home. We're building about 80. So we're way behind. Coupled with basically a third of all Californians pay over half their income in their housing. And that's just not affordable housing renters. That's people that own homes. So you have this contraction. You still have a supply deficit, which I think ultimately does revitalize the cities, because somebody's going to wake up one morning and go, wait a minute, it's not as expensive to live in the inner cities as it used to be, which I think helps, get people back there. But in terms of where the prices are going, it's always, you want me to ask where interest rates are going. I think they're going up, but boy, these things are hard to predict. But I don't think anytime you see a huge increase versus a gradual increase, you always begs the question, is that sustainable? And at what point do people just can't afford to buy those houses if they're continuing to escalate? Because, the wages aren't keeping pace, though I do think wages are now finally going up. And I don't mean just minimum wage or whatever, because there's a contraction of labor right now. And I'm not talking just in our business. I'm thinking restaurant workers, whatever, even truck drivers. I heard there's a shortage. So I do think wages are going to start going up more than they have. But are they going to keep pace with housing? Well, they're not going to keep pace with housing if the prices keep going like they are. And sooner or later, we're also going to have inflation in this country. And you're already starting to see it. And that usually will mean interest rates will follow that. And that's going to mean it's more expensive to buy a home and finance a home. So then the question is going to be, do prices then settle out when that happens, or what happens at that point? But that's kind of my crystal ball. I think in the space we're in, I mean, we do market rate housing, but we're primarily affordable housing developer. I like to say I like market rate housing in a supporting role and affordable housing in a leading role. One of the buzzwords right now.
And why do you like that? Why do you say that?
Well, because affordable housing, it's interesting. The risk profile on affordable housing is on the front end. The risk profile on market rate housing is on the back end.
And explain that to people.
You don't need a bond allocation to do market rate housing. You need to make your sources and uses work on both deals, and which in the market rate space means you need to be able to hit a certain return on cost to attract equity capital. But assuming you can do that and get a project approved and entitled and have a decent design, you're not taking the risk of competing with everybody else to get a bond allocation to do a 4% deal or even a 9% deal. So there's less risk, and a lot of times in the affordable, you also need to cobble together other soft money in order to make those deals work. When in market rate, traditionally, you're just going to have a construction loan and private equity. So the financing is a lot simpler on market rate. You can tend to do bigger projects. I like that. But also the negative of market rate is usually it requires a lot more capital investment for a company like ours, number one. And on the back end, you're taking more market rate risk when you lease it up. There's and it's not as forgiving. I mean, in affordable, if your costs go over, part of how you generate your tax credits is on basis. So in theory, part of that gets alleviated. And when you're renting it up, you're below market. I mean, our affordable housing portfolio of just under 11,000 units, we're running 97, 98% occupied. So I don't perceive that as a big risk in terms of the lease up. Where the market rate.
Do you mind if I stop you, Geoff? Do you mind if I stop you?
Yeah.
So there's a lot there. We got to cut all the way back to the beginning. But first on this, so people understand, it's not just a little bit more equity in the market rate. It's a lot more. I mean, really, what would you say your equity you're sinking in on the affordable? The entire thing's covered except for your overhead expense of your staff and whatever money you're putting into entitlements and things like that. So 90% covered.
The risk on that is on the front end. We can be investing for $500,000 to $1 million, but you're right. When the deal closes, we're typically getting that money back with your tax credit investor and your lender and your soft money. Where in the market rate deal, you're leaving. That number could be $2 to $3 million. That number could be over $10 million.
Right.
And it just depends on how much equity capital you want to have and what you have to give up for that equity capital. Right. So it's a lot more, it requires a lot more capital.
So what you said earlier is really interesting. When I heard you talk about closing the deal in Roseville that you just traded out of, you called it inflation. You didn't. So to me, it sounds like your view on this market spike, whether it be multifamily or single family, is that it's more transitory. And you may have benefited from it and locked in those gains on that property. But I didn't hear you say, oh, my apartment complex appreciated. I heard you say that it inflated. So talk to me about that, how you're thinking about that.
Well, I don't know that I think of those necessarily different. We bought the site right. We bought it at a time in a location where the path of growth in West Roosevelt wasn't as clear as it clearly is now.
Mm-hmm.
So that helped us make a good deal on it at the time we bought it, which was basically 4 years ago. And we, again, as I said earlier, we benefited, I think, from COVID in terms of the lease up and the migration to the suburbs.
Right.
It just so happens that job creation wise, both Roseville and Folsom are doing very well, as other suburbs are. Like I said, the Inland Empire and other suburbs, even around the country, at the expense of the city. So every once in a while, you get lucky in this business or unlucky with external factors that are outside your control. In this case, I think it's fair to say the external factors were in our favor.
Right. And I'm curious what you think the breaking point is. We talked about mortgages. We talked about interest rates. I mean, if you're taking mortgage rates now, really it's near zero in the sense that a lot of what's really going on with the 2 or 3% interest, if you really dig deep into that, what that really is fee generation and going down the pipeline of how that debt is being originated at the Federal Reserve. You have to have BIPs down the line until you get to, retail. And I'm curious, if rates can't go much lower and you don't see wage growth, do you think we're topping out? My question really is, how sustainable is this? I look at, an older apartment complex, maybe in Pomona, mainly in the Inland Empire, it's trading at more than 300K per unit, 400K per unit. And the people in these units, it's not like their wages are going up. So where is the breaking point? We obviously know what is the good side of the trade. The good side of the trade is to be a homeowner, realize appreciation in your real asset, be the person who owns the apartment complex, basically someone who benefits from real appreciating assets rather than a wage worker. I'm just curious when that trade breaks too far to one side, do we have something that's unsustainable?
So the way I would answer that, and I think it's correlated to inflation for a couple reasons. Number one, and it's been a long time, really, since we've been in an inflationary period. You have to go back to the late 70s. And so a lot of people really can't remember what that was even like. But I think the breaking point is going to be because there is a plethora of capital right now in the market. Too much capital chasing too few product. That's always going to mean supply and demand, appreciation of prices. So another way of asking the question you're asking me is, at what point is there not a plethora of capital? When does it start to contract? And my answer to that would be when we start to see inflation and when we start to see cap rates start to go up as a result of inflation, which carries over to interest rates going up. And we saw that, like I said, in the late 70s, early 80s. And the scary thing about that potentiality is, if it gradually occurs, I don't know that the market goes into a shocking condition. But if it doesn't gradually occur, if it becomes I'll use an example. If the 10-year Treasury were to go up 100 basis points in 3 months, that's not a gradual, or 200 basis points in 6 months. Then you're going to have to. Then I think that's going to really create some pause in the contraction of capital. Capital, you always have to remember, always is it's unemotional. It's looking for where the best return is. And so people investing into real estate, they're looking at, I can invest in commodities, I can invest in the stock market, I could even invest in bonds or whatever else they want to invest in. And right now you have this, you just have a pool of money out there as much as I can ever remember. But I think, to attempt to answer your question, like I said earlier, if the general market, we really start to see a lot of inflation, I think that's going to create other shock waves that are going to make it difficult to continue to build. And I don't, that's always hard to predict when that's going to be. I don't want to even begin to predict that. I do worry we're running up this huge federal deficit in this country, and I worry that the Fed is being too aggressive, I would say, in terms of how they're buying a lot of bonds to help finance the deficit. They're just in the market buying U.S. Treasuries. At some point, I think it catches up to us at some point. And so that, when is that inflection point going to occur? I don't think anybody, the best experts, if they had you on the podcast, economic people, I'm telling you, I'm not sure they could tell you when that's going to happen. But at some point, we're not going to see this continual increase in home prices or commodities. I don't think it's sustainable, because in the past, it's at some point but the bubbles burst.
Right. The other argument here is that the lending requirements, all the regulations are stricter now. So the people actually have the money in the bank now, is the counter argument. Now I want to get back to what we were talking about when you said the expenses to build have doubled. If we also look at the rent tables and what your tenants in affordable housing are paying rent wise, it's covering less and less of operating expenses for your buildings. And I'm curious, if we have this breaking point, it's almost a double-edged sword, because how when the rents aren't going up or the salaries aren't going up, the wages and the expenses are outpacing that, you already have slim margins in affordable housing. And a second follow-on I want to ask you is, what do you think the effect has been since you got into the business in the 80s, where a lot of the developments were a lot simpler to build? I've seen you do deals still where it's just the bonds and the rents, but more and more, it's more developers competing for additional subsidy because of these complicating factors of inflating prices and expenses, whether that's due to politics like the forest and the forest on the lumber on private land in Oregon or whatnot. But I'm curious how you think about that.
Okay. Let's go back to your comment on the lending. I agree with you. It's better than it was in the early 2000s. I worry it's starting to maybe loosen a little bit. But clearly it isn't as out of control as it was. So I agree with that comment. In terms of our situation, I don't lose a lot of sleep at night with your question, for the simple reason that our entire portfolio, we've effectively locked our biggest expense, which is our interest rate on our loan. That's our biggest expense. You look at salaries or landscaping, insurance has gone up. But if you look at, everything, utilities, our biggest expenses are debt and our interest payment on our debt. And we don't have any variable rate now. You always have to worry what happens when the loan comes due. That's always a risk. But our entire portfolio, and we've constantly over the last few years have tried to continue to take advantage of low interest rates by refinancing our loans, and in some instances, taken the excess proceeds and then reinvested it back in the community to keep the community in good condition. So we didn't have a lot of maintenance obsolete. We're not trying to kick the can down the road. We're trying to keep our communities in really good condition. And so I don't really worry necessarily as much about, I've said for many years to our employees, we haven't had inflation, but we've made decisions assuming there's going to be inflation. And so I don't know inflation's necessarily would negatively affect us on our portfolio. May negatively affect other people, but I think we've been pretty conservative with how we've done our portfolio and how we financed our existing portfolio. Now, to your comment about the industry you're right. In that we've been in this industry now 30 years. And in the 90s, costs were a lot less. And as a result, for a while, tax credit pricing was less, but gradually it came up. Interest rates were also higher. So part of what's helping finance that, besides the soft money, is we're getting more equity of tax credits. And now the bonds are fixed at 4%, and the 9% we're selling higher prices. I mean,
when you
I'm
say
talking back to the
more
90s.
equity from the tax credits, you're just essentially you're getting more sources to use to build at a higher
But we're
cost.
also getting more debt because the interest rates are less, so we can borrow more. So now you're correct. You're still correct with your question. A typical deal today compared to the 90s does require more soft money. The challenge we have with the soft money that you touched upon, or just developing in general, is over that same period of time in 30 years, we have a lot more state regulations, both in terms of entitlements, but also in terms of building requirements. They update the Uniform Building Code every 3-4 years. That's never, that effect is never mean less requirements, it's always more. And entitlements aren't simpler than they used to be, they're more complicated. And so, the amount we spend on architecture is significant, and engineering significantly more. And part of that is the consultants have more red tape they have to deal with. On top of that, as we talked about earlier, your building costs are higher. So, and we have other state requirements relative, especially whether it involves trying to get easier entitlements or using soft money. You've got labor requirements that add significant amount to cost. And we have a lot of requirements, and a lot of people say, well, why does California have such a housing problem? Because the state, they say they want to address the affordable housing. And I do think the current governor has done a very good job of making or putting more heat on the cities that didn't really want to do it to take it more seriously. He deserves a lot of credit for that. But at the same time, there's still a lot of requirements that make it more difficult to efficiently build housing than it otherwise should be, that the state obviously feels are more important than full production of affordable housing. So that is still a challenge.
Right. They almost want their cake and eat it too. They want the union pay, but they want enough housing built on a certain amount of subsidy or funding that they can solve their affordable housing problem. And basically the reality when I look around is they can't have their cake and eat it too. They can do some good. They can, they can build affordable housing and they can pay some union workers a high wage, but they can't have it all.
Right. And I think it's honestly shameful we're not producing more than we are. And for a long period of time in the late 2000 decade, in the early 2010s decade, we weren't even using all our bond allocation. Now we are way oversubscribed, but there was a probably 10 or 11 year period where we weren't even using all our bond allocation. So it's unfortunate that we're not producing more than we are. That's still obviously a goal of the industry to try to do that. I think the current governor has taken the issue a lot more seriously than the previous governor, not only because we're trying to, there's more focus on local cities and counties with their housing element, but there's also more state resources now than there was in 2017 or 2018 to soft money to help fill the subsidy gap to build the housing. So those two conditions have effectively created the condition now where there's a huge over demand now for bonds, where 5 years ago they couldn't give away they couldn't get all their allocation really funded. So it's changed a lot.
Right.
Hopefully Congress will pass this what we call 25% test and reduce the bond to 50% test, which means you have to finance half your project with bonds to only 25%, because what that would do is that would allow more bond deals to get done, which would be good for really good for California.
Right. So, I mean, there's two things that can happen. You can have massive subsidy increase to handle the high cost of building here to try to meet that supply demand imbalance, or you can have massive deregulation. I think we can agree the massive deregulation is not going to happen in California. I'm just wondering where the evidence is that it's going to happen, that there's going to be, supply and demand are going to be coming to equilibrium, because there's a lot of incentives for it not to be so. Developers are building more affordable housing than ever, but there's still, for maybe every one person who wins the lottery to have a spot in an affordable housing development, there's two people who can't find affordable housing. Now, I grant your point on the cities. That's a really good point on that. There's a lot of vacant units there. You could probably get almost luxury apartment in LA right now for less than 2,000 a month with a bunch of, weeks of free rent. But I guess my question is, where's the evidence that it's going to happen? Because I mean, right now there's bills that are trying to be passed that would give, the Huntington beaches or these places that don't want to build RENA credit for just, doing, rejiggering some apartment complexes that are already built and call it middle income housing. So there's a lot there, but, I think we both live in the real world. You as a developer, me as a journalist, there's how it seems, and then there's how it actually is. So,
well, again, I think the Huntington beaches of the world are more motivated now to meet their housing element than they've been. So that's a positive. So now, I mean, part of the problem now is dealing with all the cost increase, but also having more deals, be able to get bond allocations than currently can do it because of the demand and the current legislation that the president is trying to propose. We'll see if it gets enacted, because that's not certain for sure. Would I wouldn't say it would double, but it would probably increase the amount of bond deals, probably 75%, say, because you would go whatever 30 is into 55, whatever, I mean, that's
sure.
That because you would still, it wouldn't be a 25%, it'd probably be a 30% test. But that would make a lot more use of the bond allocation. The other thing they're trying to do is free up the rules for recycle bonds, because you've got a lot of deals that are using bond allocation. The only motivation is for the 4% credits. And so when they convert to permanent, they pay off the bonds. Well, that's kind of wasting bonds. So the legislation's also trying to make more efficient use of recycle bonds. So I think that would help a lot. It still doesn't address your question on the entitlement issue. And frankly, we're right now in California, there have been a lot of bills to try to make it easier on entitlements. And labor is basically saying, well, we'll support it if it requires labor. And it's like, well, but then you don't achieve the cost of housing, and does it really become worth it unless you have to do labor anyway? And so labor cares more about labor than they do, the building trades care more about the building trades than they do affordable housing. That's just really a fact. So that's a challenge, because I think the building trades have enough clout right now, given the composition of the state legislature and the governor, that they feel, and probably with good reason, they are empowered to do what they want to do. And right now, we're not in a position where we can get any bills through, whether it's, converting commercial land to multifamily and making that process easier, whatever. I don't see a lot of progress, unfortunately, in that area.
And that's what's so important for people to understand, is that for all the people who are hurting, there's also people who are, happy the way things are, whether that's, the people who are, union wages, or, even, last year when Scott Wiener made the push for, radical change in zoning, there are people happy with zoning the way it is. So
Right.
There are interests and there are a lot of politics in this business. And the reason there are is, this is a social, this is not just, a tech play or something like. There's a lot of social implications. This is where people live. Like, there's a lot of stake here. So last year, Geoff, when I had a lot of questions about housing. I worked in affordable housing. I worked for a nonprofit developer. And I said, what's actually going on here? So, what I decided to do, I called you, I called other top developers, I called the policy people, I talked to Scott Wiener, I talked to more mainstream politicians, and I just asked all of them the questions. And one quote I picked out today because it stood out to me. It was Andrew Jakobovitz. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name because it's been a year. He's a VP of Policy Development Enterprise. So Enterprise is one of these big conglomerates in the affordable housing industry. And I kept coming back to the question, is this a problem that is solvable? And, finally he said, realistically, quote, realistically, given the kind of demonstrated fiscal priorities of the country, I don't see this problem ever being solved. So I finally got someone to say it. And that's not to say we can't make a lot of progress. But the question I'd have for you is, what is the difference, if there is one, between building affordable housing and actually making housing affordable? Because, I come from a sports background. I like to win. I like to play to win. I think a lot of people like to play to win. They want affordable housing to be something where it's, not a game that we have to keep fighting and making incremental progress. I think people want to, play to win here. What can we do?
Well, I feel passionately enough about the industry that I don't ever want to give up on the crusade to try to solve the problem. We might have a different definition on what solving the problem means.
We may, yeah.
Obviously, we have a big homeless condition challenge that we have to, not only for a social reason, but an economic reason that we have to solve. And part of that, not all of that, is due to not enough affordable housing, but that's not all of it. I mean, you have people with mental health issues and other issues too that you've got to try to address that. And
absolutely,
I think we want to get people job trained to get them back into the working workforce, to the extent that there's a sliver of that population that can do that, which I truly believe there is, because we've seen evidence of that with programs here in Sacramento. So in terms of your question of what's affordable housing, in terms of being affordable or whatever, the only way to really address if housing is affordable is more production. And so you're right, it's difficult. I'm not going to suggest otherwise. It is very difficult, but we need to continue. And part of the challenge with our industry is the for-profit community and the nonprofit community, by and large, have different priorities. And I'm not saying one's better than the other, but the net result of that, it tends to not always make us aligned in terms of housing policy. I mean, the nonprofits, they care more about special needs and they care about deep targeting rents. I'm not saying that's not important. Production is less important to them.
Right.
where the for-profits tend to care about producing as much as possible. And under the theory that if you do that, you will create more housing affordability. And as a result, and you'll reach as many people as you can. And so cost efficiency and production are higher priorities of the for-profit community relative to the nonprofit community.
Right. I mean, I worked at a nonprofit in the affordable housing industry. Your company is a for-profit, and I've definitely seen that. Your company builds much more housing than the nonprofit I worked at per employee. You have many more projects, and you crank out a lot more units.
Right. And we're still, as a result, like I said earlier, running 97 or 98% occupied. If we were running,
and these are all affordable
85
rents.
Or 88% occupied, I think the nonprofits would have a stronger argument. But we're running 97, 98, and all our peers, we're not any better than any of our peers. They're all running the same numbers we are. Sure. So that's basically, turnover is your vacancy. We don't have a bunch of vacant units, and we don't expect anytime soon to have any vacant units on any of our communities, our affordable communities. So it's, and so I think it's important. I mean, the other part of the equation that we haven't delved into is there going to be any innovation in building housing in the state, and especially affordable housing? And, right now we're investing in partnering with our friendly competitor who we're partners with. So I consider him a close personal friend, Caleb Roop, who created a affordable housing or a modular housing facility in Boise, Idaho, which there's now 3.
And what does that mean for people who are listening? That's like factory built housing.
Factory built housing with robots, and you're creating modular units that are fully loaded spec wise, and then they're being shipped to the site. And that's a more efficient way to do it. There's restrictions relative to floor plans and stuff like that. But you're also seeing the same thing happen in a plant, Factory OX in Vallejo, which Rick Holiday is doing the same thing. And a lot of the nonprofits are actually using his model. And obviously the shipping costs from Vallejo are a lot less than they are from Boise. But what's going to help your question is hopefully we're going to have innovation in building our projects in terms of to try to engineer the costs, because that solves a lot of problems. You don't need as many. You can spread the state's resources to cover more projects, because you don't need as much subsidy on a deal if your cost isn't as high. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we got to get product becoming mainstream. We're not there yet, but I think there's a potential to get there. Manager's been around a long time. I think it's becoming more automated now with technology. And so kind of like solar had been around a long time, and then its time finally came. Right. We'll see if the same is true with modular, but I wouldn't rule that out. And we're never going to get it into a condition where everything's modular. But if modular can pick up let's say it's 15% or whatever the number is, 20%, 15%. That really helps alleviate a lot of problems, because not only do you have some material shortages in the other, you have an aging workforce in labor, and what we are encouraging. We're having programs working with the BIA and to try to encourage our residents, our kids of our employees, as well as other people, to get into the trade industry with education and training, because you can make a really good living doing that, and not everybody's cut out for college. So there's a concerted effort that we're trying to do there's still going to be that need no matter what happens with modular. In fact, some of those same people could actually work in a modular factory, but there's such a need and such a demand for housing. Modular isn't going to in any way put the stick building way out of business. It's only going to help just alleviate a pretty acute condition that we're in.
Right. But let me ask you, playing this out, how do the guys think about this? Because playing this out, say modular, you do have a technological breakthrough. I'm curious how the top guys think about whether that eats into enterprise value, or do you think zoning laws are more protective of enterprise value and per unit property values? Because
I'm not worried about that.
I haven't had people think about that or play that out
No,
as a thought
and
experiment.
where I'm more concerned, this is where I'm more concerned, because you are restricted on if you're shipping a unit size wise, because you can't, obviously a truck is only so able to ship so big a modular unit.
Yep.
My concern is more figuring out a floor plan, not just the deal we're working on. We're doing the first factory modular with our partner Caleb Roop in San Jose right now on a senior deal. It's under construction.
Okay.
Those are all studio units. I think if modular is really going to hit stride, you need to be able to also do it with larger units. The headwind against that is you're constricted what you can do when you ship it. And so it's effectively going to be like Legos, but you've got to be able to come up with a way where you can design larger units in a way, or put them in components to create larger units. Maybe the modular unit's a half unit and you fit it together like a Lego for a full unit. That's where I think the breakthrough in modular is going to be. And we're not there yet. But I do think with the material challenges, with the labor challenges, that would significantly help the building industry to create a way to create product that would take the pressure off of making it fully stick built now. And you also have a panelized model that Katerra has been working on, where it isn't the full unit, but at least it's trying to explore with new, more automated technology. And I think the industry, I think it's more a when than an if question when the industry gets there, but it could take a few years. I still think there's a lot of education the industry still needs and growing pains to get there. But I think we have to get there as an industry, given the challenges that we discussed with the cost going up.
And so say we get there, and I think we're on the same page with this, that when there's a breakthrough, you can, build out all this housing, you can have production increases, you can solve the supply or do better with the supply demand imbalance. I'm curious if you think that real estate becomes more stratified at that point, because ideally housing would become something like a smartphone. If you have technology, even the homeless have it. Every homeless person I've met has had a smartphone. And so I'm curious if you see, this wouldn't harm enterprise value. Homeowners wouldn't be scared that, all this housing's being built, my, single family home in San Luis Obispo or wherever isn't worth as much. I think that it could be, like an Apple where, there are productivity gains and, real gains for society, and the enterprise value and benefit is still there. The prices don't have to be depressed. But then again, I think that the prices for, workforce or lower income housing, they do need to be more affordable. So I don't know if it becomes more stratified. How do you think about that?
Well, in theory, you're right. I don't worry.
Well, I'm just curious. I'm not worried.
I don't. One thing I don't worry about is I don't see, maybe in some rural communities, if we start producing a lot, I don't see in my business career, or probably even in my lifetime, a condition, and that was back, I guess, to your point earlier of, quote, when do we solve the problem? I'd like to think we're going to make a lot of headway in solving the problem and want to not give up and never doing that. Having said that, do I ever see a condition where we have an oversupply of housing in California? Probably not. I think there's too many headwinds to get to that condition. Sure, you're going to have instances like we talked about earlier, like we had in '08 or the early '90s, where we'll be in a recession, it'll hit the wall, and you'll have a pause, and there won't be any building because it won't make economic sense in a moment of time for home builders or developers to build. I think in the affordable housing, in those times, it almost makes it easier for us because the trades are more hungry. It's easier to buy land, and I don't think the production of affordable housing, even in a downturn, necessarily stops. But in terms of market rate, whether it's an apartment or whether it's a single family home, sure, you're going to have a slowdown and some kind of maybe pullback in prices. But I don't see a condition where we've solved this problem and we've just got to, we become what potentially Phoenix or Las Vegas or Atlanta or Texas, or Denver, where you have an ability in all those markets to just produce on a mass scale without really, Houston, they don't even have zoning, or used to not even have zoning in Houston. I don't know if they do or not anymore, but you definitely have fewer barriers of entry to building housing and constraints to building housing in other parts of the country, which makes it a lot easier to get in an overbuilt condition. I don't see that really being something that's going to happen in California, certainly in the next 20 years. I just don't see that as a reality. What I hope occurs is for your generation particularly, is and the next generation after that, is enough supply being created where we don't continue to have this escalation of pricing, and that if it's paused for a while, the wages can maybe catch up. But there's a lot of external factors that play into that.
So the idea, Geoff, real quick, is that the technological innovation would overcome the lack of political reform. Is that sort of what you're getting at in terms of California? Because you're saying, we're not going to have zoning.
I don't know that I would use the word overcome. It might help alleviate it.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to overcome it, but it might help alleviate it. That's the way I would say it.
Got it. Okay. And then adding on to that, massive subsidy, right? Because you're going to need that too.
Well, you don't need, again, as I said earlier, though, you don't need as much of it if there's technological innovation that allows you to do it. Now, whether or not that can play itself out on some kind of scale, like I said earlier, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It would be nice if we could get there, because it would be nice to, whatever precious public resources we have, we're in the business of using public resources on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm a taxpayer of California, and it's important to me that we use our public resources as judiciously as possible, as efficiently as possible, to get the most bang for our buck. I really passionately feel as strongly about that.
Yeah.
And so anytime where I don't see that occurring, I get frustrated. Yeah. Just like I get frustrated with dead space on a unit or on a property. I hate inefficiency. It's nails on a chalkboard to me.
Yeah, especially in California.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, as a young person, I guess one thing that's been tough as a young journalist is, how do I navigate all the noise? Because we're having a sober conversation about this, realistic conversation about this relative to other places like Houston, but there's so much talk, there's this, there's that. And I mean, what would you say to young people who are trying to understand things as they actually are and navigate this? From your
You
experience as a
know,
developer?
as a developer or somebody starting out, when you're,
No, well, your experience as a developer just informs that because you've had to live in the, navigate the real world, and not just all these different narratives that you see in the media or from politicians.
well, I mean, are you asking me to any young person or a person getting into development? That's what I'm trying to understand.
No, I mean a young person who's just trying to understand how actually things are, because I know young people in my journalism program who, just believe the spin like, oh, we are gonna, fix it through this government subsidy. Because let's be real, that's what it, sometimes it's put out into the press as, this subsidy is gonna make it, or that thing is gonna, could this be the fix to California's problem? You see an article like that, this one zoning change or this or
Right.
that. How would you encourage young people to navigate all that information that's being thrown?
So and it wouldn't be limited to just affordable housing in California. The subject would pertain to a lot of subjects. I would encourage people to ask a lot of questions to people, tune into podcasts like this, just to become more educated and try to really get a better understanding of what the issues are and why they are the way they are. And also, I would encourage people to speak up and have a voice and be engaged. I mean, we need young people in your generation to be engaged in any kind of public policy, let alone affordable housing, any kind of public policy. That's very important to trying to get to a better place on any issue, just not only our industry.
Yeah. All right. So I got to ask you a few more questions. You ready for it?
Fire away.
All right. So I still got to figure this out. So if affordable housing is not in the real world, is not exactly about making all housing affordable.
Yes.
It's about, navigating these political realities and making affordable housing and doing what you can with what you have. I don't know. That's just a weird thing to grasp. I don't know. I'm so used to like sports or something that's much more black and white.
So, Matt, let me attempt to answer this. I don't know if I'll succeed on your end, but let me attempt to answer this. I think the home builders, they vary on what type of product they do, but a lot of them really geared to the entry level to try to keep their cost down.
Okay.
Our situation is a little bit different on the affordable, and then I'll get to the market rate apartment part. On the affordable, the HUD, as you know, is setting all our rents. So making it affordable to live, the nonprofits would say, well, they're trying to do it by deep targeting the rents. As I said earlier, the for-profits are trying to do it because the rents are already way below market in most cases in California. We're trying to do it to capture as many people that can live in our communities and take advantage of being able to live in affordable housing. So that's our attempt to do it. But there's a segment of the market that we shouldn't ignore in your question. And that's a segment of the market where people maybe don't want to buy or can't afford to buy a house. And so they live in an apartment and they make too much money. So they're over 60% median income. And so they have to live in a market rate apartment. And so one of the trends you're going to see forward that we are working on is trying to come up with a model for workforce housing, which means you're paying not a market rate price. You make too much income to live in an affordable community, but maybe you are paying a rent anywhere from 80 to 120% median income. And so what does that mean in rent? That could mean anywhere from a third more to what somebody's paying 60% median income is, to double that. Probably in most cases, that number is like 50% more in rent versus a very low subsidized rent. but still below what they would have to pay in a market rate condition. And so there are equity funds out there looking at this. We're trying to come up with economic models to capture and to provide workforce housing. We're trying to use our own affordable housing product because we constantly turn away over income people that want to live in our communities. That would pay higher rent than 60% median income. I mean,
Right.
if you drive by one of USA's communities, you don't think it's affordable housing. We build nice communities. I don't mind. I know that sounds like I'm bragging, but don't take my word, take other people's word. So we're trying to take our product and cater it to a higher income, same product, and be able to structure the financing where it can support not charging full market rent and capture a segment of the market that needs, effectively, to your question, more affordable housing.
Right. But the way this is done is, and this is where I question how much longer is this sustainable, is you're taking tax exempt bonds to do this with 100% debt. That's the model
Not with workforce, we're not.
Okay. I'm just saying that's the model I've seen that's already out there.
Workforce, I mean, the only way you'd be using tax exempt bonds is if you did a nonprofit 501c3 issue, because CIDLAC's rules don't allow really. There's income averaging, so some units right now you can go up to 8%. I'm talking workforce housing, and in most instances you would be using private capital. You might get some small little government subsidy, but nothing like we're getting on an affordable, because the idea behind it is you wouldn't need as much, because it would support a higher rent supports a bigger loan and more economic. So you don't need as much subsidy, but you still need to make the numbers work in a way where the people living in the community are feeling like they're getting a below market rent.
Right.
But there's a lot of talk nationally because this is not only a problem in California, it's a problem in a lot of high cost areas in the country. We need more workforce housing to alleviate the condition I said earlier, where over a third of our residents are paying more than half of their income in rent. So I do think that is going to be a condition. And again, to your question about affordable housing, my definition of affordable housing, even though that extends beyond just Section 42 type of communities with tax credits, to me, we should be trying to make all housing in California affordable to the extent possible, because when you look at the need, the greatest need is in that space. They want to build high-end luxury, have at it. But if you look at the demographics of need, that's not where the biggest need is. It's in whether it's an entry-level single-family home, or whether it's a firefighter or a teacher that wants to live in an apartment but not pay full market rent given what their income is, or whether it's in affordable housing, where we have or tax credit, a low-income housing tax credit, 60% or less of median income.
Yeah,
that's where the need is.
Right, and you mentioned a firefighter and a teacher, and one thing I've thought about is, a firefighter and a teacher, they could come and buy a home in a coastal community in the 70s or 80s. And I'm not trying to live in the past, but I am trying to say that the trade is not as good for the middle class. The deal is not as good for the middle class in California as it was before. So the deal now is, I'm going to have, some sophisticated actors figure out how to make my rent affordable instead of paying 50%. And, I know families, some people who moved to Boise, Idaho last year, they got in at the last minute in the Boise market. They were able to buy a home up there. And, who knows, it might be up like 30% now, but which is crazy. Like we said, that may be, a temporary thing. But my thought is, what's the trade for the middle class here? If you're making $150K in California, and, you're paying 20-30% in taxes, 25 to 35% in rent, which that would be considered affordable.
Right.
What's your take on that? and on that salary compared to somewhere else? And what's your future? Are you going to be able to roll that into a mortgage or a down payment? So I just think the trade for the middle class, regardless of making rents affordable, is just not what it was decades ago.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And that is a big challenge for California to try to keep the middle class. It's one of the reasons we moved our business here to Sacramento from LA 1993, because we thought it was more affordable to live in Sacramento. This is something the state needs to continue to try to address, because you never want to lose your middle class. And you're correct. A lot of people are moving out of the state because of our, not just the housing cost, but because of the tax policy of the state being what it is. And we need to try to create a better tax policy and more affordable housing. And unfortunately, you have a lot of headwinds, political headwinds that tend to counteract that. And that's a big challenge for the state. There's no debating that.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, being brutally honest, like myself, cutting costs, whether that's living at home, making a little bit of money. It's scary that with shrewd investments in this environment since COVID, I can do better on a after-tax basis than someone who makes 150K, who's productive, who has a family. That just doesn't seem right. That seems like things are screwed up.
Right.
So anyways, I find that interesting. It's like Charlie Munger said, show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome.
There you go.
Geoff, it's been good to have you on. Do you have any questions for me?
I don't. I appreciate the time to talk to you about this, and I hope I answered all your questions in a way that the audience will understand and appreciate and hopefully learn, and appreciate you doing your podcast on various issues to educate the public.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Last thing, what advice would you give to a young person who's navigating this environment financially?
Navigating the affordable housing in California environment?
Affordable housing, asset prices, whether it's stocks, real estate, whatever, their salaries or what they are.
My advice would be try to get on the ladder, get a good job, do something you love. John Wooden's comment was, you find a job you love, you'll never have to work a day in your life. That's, to me, the most important thing. Financially, I'm a big believer, and I love it. We lose residents in our communities, in our affordable housing communities. Harder today maybe than it was 20 years ago, but we still do, to buy houses. I love that outcome because it's to me a poster child of what we're trying to do to help people. And it's not like I have to worry we're going to be able to fill the unit back up. So my advice to young people is sooner rather than later, if there's a way, assuming you're going to want to live somewhere or think you do, is I would try to buy a house or something sooner rather than later, and get on, just like it's important to get on the work and employment ladder to get experience. I would try to get on the housing, because your point about assets is correct. And I would try to buy something sooner rather than later if you can. Don't get overextended doing that, though. You got to know what you're signing up for in doing that. But I would encourage people to do that, because I think if you can, like I said earlier, you were asking about our expenses in our apartment projects. Young people, in theory, their income should go up as they get more experience and more responsibility. If they buy a house and they lock their interest rate, they're locking their biggest personal expense. Just like I told you, we were doing that in our portfolio on our property expense with our loan. That would be my advice to young people.
Yeah. All right, Geoff Brown, President and CEO of USA Properties. Go check out a property if you didn't believe him when he said they build high quality. They do. Thanks, Geoff.
Thank you so much, man. Take care.